The Roman Empire wasn't murdered in a day. It was more like a slow, 300-year decline, a story far more complex than a simple tale of barbarians at the gates. We picture a dramatic, fiery end, but that's just the final scene of a much longer, stranger story. While invading armies and political chaos were definitely part of the picture, some of the most dangerous enemies were the ones you couldn't see. An invisible poison that may have seeped into the water, a silent hunger that stripped forests bare, and a creeping exhaustion that turned fertile fields into dust. For centuries, Rome was a machine of consumption, devouring resources on a scale the world had never seen. But machines need fuel, and the empire's relentless appetite created a crisis of its own making. Some regions ran out of trees, some ran out of fertile soil, and some grappled with the consequences of their own pollution. This isn't just a story of military defeat. It's also the story of how environmental pressures can weaken a civilization from the inside out, making it vulnerable to all the other shocks that followed. Forget the simple story of the fall of Rome. This is how Rome's foundations slowly eroded away. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Eternal Rome. To understand how it all went wrong, you first have to appreciate how spectacularly it all went right. Picture Rome at its peak during the 2nd century AD. This wasn't just a kingdom. It was, for all intents and purposes, the world. At its height, the Roman Empire governed a staggering portion of the known world. From the drizzly shores of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia, an estimated 75 million people, maybe a quarter of the entire global population, lived under its rule. Its cities were marvels. Rome itself was a sprawling metropolis of over 1 million souls, a population size not seen again in Europe until London in the 19th century. Its streets were alive with commerce, its forums echoed with the debates of law and philosophy, and its Colosseum could seat 60,000 spectators for brutal, magnificent spectacles. This civilization was built on a foundation of unprecedented control over the natural world. 11 massive aqueducts carried a constant supply of fresh water into the heart of the city, a feat of engineering that was simply unmatched. They had complex sewer networks like the Cloaca Maxima to keep cities sanitary. A vast network of paved roads, the arteries of the empire, connected far-flung provinces, allowing legions, goods, and ideas to move with astonishing speed. The economy was a powerhouse, fueled by a stable, silver-based currency, the denarius, which was trusted in markets from Spain to Syria. The Mediterranean Sea, once a barrier, became a Roman lake, the Mare Nostrum, our sea, across which ships carried Egyptian grain, Spanish olive oil, and Gallic pottery. All of this was underwritten by the Pax Romana, a 2-century-long era of relative peace and stability, enforced by the most disciplined military machine the world had ever known. To an observer in the year 150 AD, the Roman Empire must have seemed eternal. Its success was built on a simple, unspoken promise that the resources to fuel this incredible machine were infinite. The forests would always provide wood, the fields would always yield grain, and the mines would always surrender their silver. It was a beautiful, powerful, and deeply dangerous illusion. Because as Rome was busy conquering the world, it was waging a quieter war against the very environment that sustained it. Chapter 2. The Silent Cost of Industry. The first victim of Rome's insatiable hunger was the forest. Wood was the foundational resource of the ancient world, the plastic, steel, and concrete of its day, and the Romans consumed it on an industrial scale. Every aspect of Roman life demanded timber. Wood was the primary fuel for heating the million-person metropolis of Rome and its sprawling network of public baths. It was used to construct roofing for buildings and the floors for multi-story apartment blocks. But the real driver of deforestation was industry. The empire's vast mining operations were voracious consumers of wood. In places like Spain, thousands of tons of timber were needed for mine support and for the charcoal required in smelting. Extracting silver from lead-rich ore involved heating it to extreme temperatures, and every ounce of silver for the empire's coins came at the cost of countless trees. Shipyards, which built the merchant fleets and warships, also consumed entire forests. The list goes on: pottery kilns, lime production for cement, and even military campaigns. The consequences of this relentless clear-cutting were severe. starting with the soil itself. The Mediterranean landscape, with its thin topsoil and heavy seasonal rains, was particularly vulnerable. Once the trees were gone, there was nothing to stop the deluge. Rain pounded the exposed earth, washing away the precious, fertile topsoil. Roman writers like Pliny the Elder observed this, describing how deforestation led to devastating torrents. Modern studies confirm their observations, suggesting that soil erosion rates during the Roman period were significantly higher than natural levels. As the empire expanded, this process accelerated in many regions. That eroded soil had to go somewhere. It flowed into rivers, choking them with silt. This led to a cascade of secondary disasters. Rivers that were once navigable became shallow and unpredictable. The increased runoff also appears to have caused more frequent and severe flooding in cities like Rome. The silt also flowed out to sea, dramatically altering coastlines and rendering old harbors useless, a constant and costly burden. This transformation of the landscape may have had another sinister effect. As forests were cleared and natural drainage was disrupted, some low-lying areas became waterlogged, creating stagnant, marshy wetlands. These new marshes, like the infamous Pontine marshes southeast of Rome, became ideal breeding grounds for mosquitoes, which carried malaria. While the precise impact of malaria on the empire's fall is still debated by historians, the spread of this debilitating disease certainly placed an additional strain on the population's health and vitality. Chapter 3. The Dying Land. The damage didn't stop at the water's edge. The very same pressures that stripped hills of their trees also sapped the life from the empire's agricultural heartlands. At its core, the Roman economy was an agrarian one. Its cities, armies, and social structure all depended on a steady supply of food, especially grain. To feed its huge population, Rome pushed its agricultural system to the limit. A major issue in some regions was a system of continuous, intensive farming. Farmers often cultivated the same plots year after year, planting grain crops that rapidly depleted the soil of nutrients. While some Roman agricultural writers understood the importance of crop rotation and using legumes to replenish the soil, these practices were often ignored in the face of relentless demand. When existing fields became exhausted and yields dropped, the common response wasn't to change methods, but to simply clear more forests for new farmland, creating a vicious cycle. This was made worse by overgrazing. Herds of animals, particularly goats, were often allowed to graze on hillsides, stripping them of plant cover and worsening soil erosion. What was once the breadbasket of the Republic was becoming a tired land. The agriculturalist Varro wrote of abandoned fields, and 2 centuries later, Columella remarked that without grain imported from the provinces, the people of Latium would have starved. This forced Rome into a critical and ultimately fragile strategic position. It became deeply dependent on grain from its overseas provinces. Latium, Campania, Sicily, and Spain were each in turn exploited, and some faced soil exhaustion. The ultimate prize was Egypt. With the Nile's annual flood naturally replenishing its soil, Egypt was the one province that seemed immune. It became the personal property of the emperor, its immense grain surplus shipped across the Mediterranean to feed Rome's population through the state-subsidized grain dole, the cura annii. For a time, this system worked, but this dependence created a profound vulnerability. The stability of the capital now rested on a fragile, 1,000-mile-long supply chain. Any disruption, pirates, war, or bad weather, could lead to immediate food shortages and riots. As the empire weakened, this vulnerability became a gaping wound. When the Vandals conquered North Africa in the 5th century, they seized one of Rome's key grain sources. While the Western Empire was already in a state of severe decline, this act was like seizing the jugular of an already bleeding man. Chapter 4. A Poisoned Chalice. Rome's mastery over water is legendary, but this triumph of engineering may have harbored a hidden danger. Lead. The Romans used lead, or plumbum, where we get our word plumbing, for almost everything. It was cheap, malleable, and waterproof. They famously used it for the pipes that distributed water from the aqueducts. They were aware lead had toxic properties. Pliny the Elder noted the noxious vapors from lead furnaces. But its convenience seemed to outweigh the risk. Contamination didn't stop at the pipes. Romans used lead to line cooking pots and, most troublingly, as a sweetener for wine. They would boil grape juice in lead pots to create a sweet syrup called sapa, which was added to wine to improve its taste and preserve it. The theory that lead poisoning contributed to the fall of Rome has been debated for centuries. Proponents argue that chronic low-level lead exposure was common, particularly among the elite who could afford piped water and lead-sweetened wine. They suggest this could have led to widespread health problems, including infertility and cognitive decline, weakening the ruling class. However, many historians are skeptical. They argue that the water in Roman aqueducts was often hard, meaning lead pipes would have quickly become coated with limescale, reducing how much lead leached into the water. Plus, the rural majority of the population would have had far less exposure. But recent science has added a new twist. Analysis of Arctic ice cores shows a dramatic spike in airborne lead pollution during the Roman era, generated by the empire's massive silver mining and smelting operations. This process released huge quantities of lead particles into the atmosphere, which traveled on the winds across the globe. Some recent studies have speculated this widespread pollution could have had a subtle, negative cognitive impact across the population. But this is a new and not yet mainstream theory. It is, however, a stark reminder that the very industries that created Rome's wealth were also releasing pollutants into the environment, one of many stressors on a complex society. Chapter 5. When the Heavens Turned. As if the problems Rome was creating for itself weren't enough, the natural world delivered its own blows. For centuries, from about 200 BC to 150 AD, the empire enjoyed what's known as the Roman climatic optimum. The weather was generally warm, stable, and well-watered, perfect for agriculture. This climatic stability was a hidden subsidy that underpinned the empire's growth. But around 150 AD, the climate began to get less predictable. And later, in the 6th century, things took a dramatic turn for the worse. The world lurched into a period of prolonged cooling now known as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, triggered by a series of massive volcanic eruptions in 536, 540, and 547 AD. The eruption in 536 AD was apocalyptic, spewing a colossal plume of aerosols into the atmosphere and creating a volcanic winter. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness. Like the moon, summer temperatures plunged, causing widespread crop failures and famine. Now it's crucial to get the timeline right here. This catastrophe and the horrifying plague of Justinian that followed in 541 AD struck after the Western Roman Empire had already officially fallen in 476 AD, so they didn't cause the West's collapse, but they were devastating for the surviving Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. These events shattered Emperor Justinian's dream of reconquering and reuniting the old empire and arguably put the final nail in the coffin for the ancient Roman world. It was a 1-2 punch of climate shock and pandemic that the remnants of the Roman world were simply unequipped to withstand. Chapter 6. The Economic Death Spiral. While the environment was under stress, Rome's economy was actively self-destructing. For centuries, the empire's strength was built on sound money, the silver denarius. This coin had a high silver content, so it was trusted everywhere. But the empire's expenses were enormous. Maintaining a massive army, funding public works, and providing subsidized grain all came at a tremendous cost. When the empire stopped expanding, the flow of new wealth from conquered lands slowed to a trickle, but the expenses didn't. So, emperors turned to a seemingly easy solution: currency debasement. They started reducing the amount of silver in their coins, mixing it with cheaper metals like copper, while forcing everyone to accept the new coins at the old value. It started with Emperor Nero, but it soon spiraled out of control. By the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of civil war and invasion, the debasement became frantic. Emperors needed to pay their soldiers, and this was the quickest way. A new coin, the Antoninianus, was introduced, supposedly worth 2 denarii but containing far less silver. By around 265 AD, some coins contained as little as 0.5% to 2% silver, little more than a bronze coin with a thin silver wash. The consequences were catastrophic, unleashing hyperinflation. People lost all trust in the currency. Prices for everyday goods skyrocketed. Citizens hoarded older, purer coins or just resorted to barter. This economic chaos shattered the unified imperial economy. It destroyed the savings of ordinary people, and crippled the state's ability to collect taxes. Intended to solve the state's financial problems, debasement created a vicious feedback loop that tore the economy apart. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. These were not separate crises. The environmental stress, the agricultural struggles, the political chaos, and the economic death spiral were all deeply interconnected. They wove together to form the perfect storm that unraveled the Roman world. Think of it as a domino effect. Regional deforestation led to soil erosion and lower crop yields. Lower yields meant less food and less tax revenue, making the state weaker. A weaker state struggled to maintain infrastructure or fund its army. Financial desperation then led emperors to debase the currency, which triggered hyperinflation that shattered trade. This breakdown of trade was devastating for an empire that depended on grain from North Africa to feed its capital. An empire that was once a single integrated economic zone began to fragment into self-sufficient regions, causing a dramatic decline in overall wealth and complexity. It was into this hollowed-out, fragile empire that waves of migrating peoples like the Goths and Vandals arrived in the 4th and 5th centuries. These migrations weren't the sole cause of Rome's fall, but more a symptom of its advanced decay. The empire they encountered was a shadow of its former self, weakened by disease, crippled by a dysfunctional economy, and struggling to feed its own people. The empire had lost its resilience. It no longer had the economic or demographic reserves to absorb the shocks of invasion, climate instability, or internal rebellion. The complex system that had been its greatest strength became its greatest weakness. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD wasn't a single event, but the final outcome of a long, slow unraveling. The so-called barbarians didn't push over a mighty fortress. They walked through the gates of a house that was already collapsing from the inside out. Conclusion. The story of Rome's fall is often told as an epic of clashing armies and scheming emperors. But the deeper story is written in the soil, the ice, and the silent stones. Rome's collapse wasn't a simple failure of politics or military strategy. It was a complex, systemic failure. It was a civilization that achieved unparalleled greatness by mastering its environment, and then was weakened as it pushed that environment, its economy, and its own people past the breaking point. Its environmental degradation was a significant contributing factor among many others, including political instability, endless civil wars, economic mismanagement, and pandemics. The deforestation, soil exhaustion, and pollution weren't the single cause, but they were a constant, underlying stress that made every other problem worse. And this isn't just ancient history. The story of Rome is a chillingly relevant cautionary tale. It's a story about the complex, fragile relationship between a civilization, its resources, its climate, and its economy. It shows how environmental problems are never just environmental problems. They are economic, social, and political crises waiting to happen. The challenges Rome faced, resource depletion, pandemics, and the destabilizing effects of a changing climate, are echoes of the challenges we face today, only on a vastly larger, planetary scale. Rome's empire is gone, but the lesson etched into its ruins remains. A civilization, no matter how powerful, cannot survive indefinitely if it ignores the foundations that support it. The fall of Rome is a stark reminder that true, lasting strength is found not just in consumption and expansion, but in balance and resilience.